Philippines, pressure on South Korea to say, stop cooperating with American defense policy. Those of you who follow these events know that there was a mini crisis with the Philippines in 2012, another mini crisis with the Vietnamese in 2014, and a sort of a mini crisis with South Korea in 2016. They weren't crises for China, but they were crises for the Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea. Because China was saying, are you sure you want to cooperate with the United States? We can make life very difficult for you. And are you sure you want to cooperate with the United States? Are you sure they're reliable? And the Philippines and Vietnam and even South Korea found we weren't reliable because we were not prepared to risk war with China over some island in the South China Sea. And all those countries improved relation with China. Now, there's a bit of a pushback. We do have a new president in the Philippines who seems to have some nationalist inclination to challenge China over islands that have no economic interest, that have no military significance, but he's relying on U.S. defense policy to help him challenge China. The crisis with the Philippines is around the corner. It sure looks that way. Things are getting very bad with the Philippines. South Korea has been more cautious. It will not participate in American technology policy, the same way the Europeans said over the weekend they will not participate in American steel policy, right? But still the South Koreans are cooperating more with America. Nonetheless, Chinese policy is clear: challenge American alliances. Well, what's America's response? Well, a number of things. America, of course, has a problem. There's an American expression. We say, house rich, cash poor. And what that means is America has spent a lot of money on domestic welfare programs. 70% of our budget is on domestic welfare programs. And then what's left is 30%, and about 60% of what's left already goes to defense. There is no money in the US budget to increase defense spending. We cannot reallocate 70% by law. We cannot reallocate unless we change the law. As we all know, our Republicans and Democrats are not going to change the laws. So what are we left with? We're left with a Navy that cannot compete with the Chinese Navy. Cannot. It's impossible. For the next 20 years, it's impossible. We will not be able to compete with the Chinese Navy. Chinese Navy will soon have 400 ships, and we will soon have about 240, 250. These are good ships with good missiles. China produces about 40% of the world's ships every year. South Korea produces 47% of the ships every year. The United States produces less than 1% of the ships in the world, commercial ships. We cannot race the Chinese. We have no ship industry. We have no maintenance industry. We have no repair industry. Our ships are old. They are very old. They cost a lot to operate and a lot to maintain and repair. We have new ships, but we thought we would use these new ships against pirates, not against China. So we are taking these new ships and we're getting rid of them because they're no longer valuable. What are we doing? We're trying to take as many ships out of service to save as much money as we can to build a new Navy. And that means the US Navy is going to get smaller before it gets better. That's a reality. America's response, however, is what are we going to do? We have there are no American bases in the South China Sea that have any value whatsoever. No bases in the Philippines are valuable because Chinese missiles can take them out in the first day. Singapore is not valuable. Chinese missiles can take them out in the first day. South Korean bases aren't valuable. Guam is in trouble. We cannot compete inside the South China Sea because China's Navy is too big and Chinese bases, American bases, are too vulnerable. So what are we doing? Well, we're doing two things. This is the Quad. We're looking for new friends in new places. Australia. We always cooperated with Australia with satellites. Now we want submarine bases, air bases, naval bases. Why? Because it's outside the South China Sea. India. We now are talking about having a maintenance facility in India. We need more maintenance facilities. We don't have enough. India, build one for us outside the South China Sea. Papua New Guinea, building a new naval base. Micronesia, building a new naval base. Cooperating with Palau everywhere. What are we doing? We are encircling East Asia from outside East Asia. We have given up on South China Sea, Yellow Sea, and Taiwan Strait, and basically the East China Sea. This is a retrenchment policy. 10 years ago, I had a briefing at the Naval War College where it said 10 years ago, the best American boats could do was to sail into Singapore in the middle of the night, get some fuel, and then get out before the sun comes out. That was 10 years ago. Now you can't go into Singapore anytime. The US ship goes into Singapore, the Chinese can find it, but it's not moving, it's dead. India, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Micronesia, Palau, Wake, Tinian, all those islands from World War II. This is America's new defense policy. We're looking for friends elsewhere because our friends in East Asia are no longer strategically valuable. Now, what else are we doing? Well, the Biden administration is not prepared to accept that reality of the rise of China. Am I talking too long? Am I okay? Is not prepared to accept the rise of China. So even as the military retrenches, the Biden administration has an extensive containment policy. And don't take my word for it. Listen to what they say. Technology. When the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, announced our technology policy, he said, the purpose of this policy is to maintain American military superiority over China. He said that. He said, technology is key to military capabilities in the 21st century. Therefore, we will deny China high technology so that we can maintain superiority as the #1 military in the power in the world. That's what he said. Our trade policy. Our trade representative said very clearly that we were caught by surprise at how successful the Chinese model was. They caught up so fast. Well, now we're trying to weaken that model. And there was a big debate in the administration between those who said that trade policy is hurting America, it's got no value, and she said we need leverage against the Chinese economy so that we can maintain America's economic advantages. The Secretary of Commerce said very clearly, the purpose of our tech, she was asked, do you have this technology to bring down the Chinese military? And she was not ready for the question, so we got an honest answer. Yes, she said, I hope so. Yes. So what else are we doing? We're expanding US cooperation with South Korea, and it's not about North Korea. No one thinks North Korea is going to start a war against the most powerful military in the world, and the 5th most powerful military in the world. It would be suicide. We're building 4 new bases in the Philippines. We have taken the initiative, not in response to China, we have taken the initiative beginning in 2018 to improve relations with Taiwan. We're increasing our encirclement of China to try and contain the rise of China and weaken their economic growth. We're leaning on countries around the world. We're leaning on South Korea. We're leaning on Japan. Cooperate with American trade policy, cooperate with American technology policy. We have leaned very heavily on European countries, including the Netherlands, including Germany. We want contributions to our technology policy and our trade policy. Europe has been very reluctant to join America's Cold War with China. And so this weekend, Europe said no, they will not contribute to American resistance to buying steel from China. The South Koreans have said they will not participate, will not end their supply chains with Chinese high technology Countries are reluctant to sacrifice their economic growth, their trade relation with China to support America's Cold War. I suggest both countries are facing a very difficult domestic condition in both countries. The Chinese are at a turning point in the rise of China. They've got two major domestic problems. One is that they have to find a way to get the private sector growing again. The private sector is very nervous because the economy doesn't look very strong. They don't trust the government to continue with the private sector support, and they don't trust the state-owned enterprises, which has private government support, to not gobble them up and force them to sell. And second, you've read about China's demographic problem. There is no demographic problem in China. They got 4 times the population of the United States and the economy about the same. The problem is productivity. If they had the same labor productivity as the United States, they'd have an economy 4 times the size of the United States. They need to find a way to reinvest in their companies to improve productivity by investing in pre-existing companies. Not clear they can. State-owned enterprises don't need to, soft budget constraints. The private sector is afraid to invest. And second, they're dealing with the American technology controls, and it has them very worried about the future. What should China do? Keep their head down, bide their time. Don't challenge America. Don't challenge in the Philippines. Don't challenge in technology or trade, so they can create an environment in which Europe will cooperate with China. South Korea will cooperate with China. But that's really hard. America's got a containment policy. You're not supposed to retaliate. Many Chinese think the Chinese government is going to be unable to resist the need to retaliate against American containment, and it will hurt China. The Americans have a problem. Inflation, perhaps a recession around the corner. Our parties are locked in polarized gridlock. White House is ineffective. Race relations are horrible. Violence is horrible. Border policy is a mess. Budget deficits are off the chart. And here we are trying to compete with a declining Navy. Many Americans think this is a time where America should keep your head down and rebuild your economy first, put your house in order, rebuild your Navy. Neither country is doing what they should be doing. They're both unable to resist the pressures, China against the United States and the United States against a rising China. This is a battle of 2 countries, both of which cannot afford a new Cold War. Thank you, Enrico.
Right. That's fascinating as always. I guess we're going to have a very stimulating Q&A, but without too much further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Professor Orlandi. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Enrico. Thanks to the host, thanks the organizer, thanks my colleague. It's an honor and a privilege for me to comment on Professor Ross' enlightening speech. So thank you for your attention. Bob, I really appreciate your realistic approach. You didn't say something which sounds idealistic. I do remember what a very well-known Minister of Foreign Affairs said: countries and nations, they do not have principles, they do have interest. Allow me to say even more realistic, if possible. And the interests of China and the US, they are in collision at the moment. Now, how deep the collision is difficult to ascertain, but they are colliding. And seen from the Chinese perspective, it seems to me it is inevitable. China is trying to cash in the political dividends of its economic success. That doesn't make justice of the fact that we were a bit naive to think that China, at the end of this opening process and dialogue with the West, could have been transformed in a country, let's say, like us, to belonging to the international values, to what we call democracy, a parliamentary democracy, even with Chinese characteristics. China took advantage of globalization, took advantage of this bizarre marriage which took place between the multinational companies of Europe and the US, with the delocalization, reshoring in China, offshoring in China, and that made China powerful. So paradoxically, we help China to become stronger, and now we're going to pay the consequences, whatever that means. In the Pacific, China is no longer timid or bashful or shy to flex its muscles. Why? Because it is strong enough to flex the muscles. The time of Deng Xiaoping, you recall, abide your time, hide yourself, do not provoke anybody. The main objective of Chinese policy was to grow, was to defeat underdevelopment, to become strong enough not to face another century of humiliation. We might have some recollection of what happened during the 70s. At the end of the Maoist era, when Mao Zedong passed away in 1976, China was a political giant and an economic dwarf. The situation in Asia was very tense. The war in Vietnam, the unsolved problem still unsolved in Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, the tension in Vietnam, in Taiwan, the guerrillas led by the communists with insurgencies everywhere, the Philippines, Indonesia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, the animosity with India, even the animosity and the war against the supposed to be allied Soviet Union. China was weak and was alone. The only way to avoid any other splitting of the country, any other humiliation, invasion of foreign forces, was to grow. That was a masterpiece by Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China, Deng Xiaoping, which was imprisoned in jail at that time, but he was the architect of the peace, let's say peace, with the United States. You recall the trip of President Nixon to China. And from that time, China grew like no other country in the world did. Let's say 10% of growth of GDP every single year. No other country in the world was so successful, consistent, lucky. That was a bizarre marriage between the birth of globalization and the necessity of China. The idea that China could have been admitted to the World Trade Organization in the year 2001 is the rationale behind the decision that China could have been controlled, maybe manipulated, that China could have been shy, could have been at the end assimilated to the Western values. Nothing of that happened. China is still China. China is different. Either we like it or not. China is a country building great walls to protect it, military, ideologically, politically. And that came as a surprise, because somebody at that time, maybe the mainstream of the scholar, thought that the history was over, that the values of democracy, the values of individualism, the values of entrepreneurship could be prevailing everywhere. China proved with its might that you can reach the growth of GDP, the prosperity of your people, the might of your country, even without a democratic system. Then a thought came blatant in China, like a succession of the history, which we know is not true. They were very cut in the Chinese history. So Mao Zedong made China independent. Deng Xiaoping made China richer. Xi Jinping is making China stronger. If somebody opposes to this strength, this is what Bob said before: collision, tension, building of Navy. Now, why China is doing this? Why the foreign policy of China is so assertive? Because China is strong enough. And consequently, they see the US not anymore as an invincible armada. Which are the weapons of China? Commercial weapons. If you sign this treaty with the US, I stop sending you my goods. You mentioned, Bob, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand. Every country of East Asia, including Japan and South Korea, have the main trading partner with China. How can you compete against China? Now, trade and economy, they become political weapons. They might become even military weapons. Take the example of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. They do a very lucky combination: protection by the US, economic growth stimulated by China. How long can they be neutral in this competition? How long can they preserve their national identity and their security without taking any position between China and the US? Is China provoking to take side? In a sense, yes. China is strong, and it has a strong helmsman. Not because Xi is strong by nature, in my opinion, but because Xi Jinping is the best man for Chinese necessity at this moment. A strong country needs a strong man as a political decision. How far the collision will go? Not necessarily to a military confrontation. But the East Asia quiet, the Chinese ready just to be the factory of the world, the China that we know manufacturing consumer good with low added value, the factory of the world, we said that, is closed. Now it's 5G, electronics, security, shoes, garments might be done somewhere else, maybe around China. This is serious. And how serious it will be, I don't know, nobody knows. But the tension is rising because the interests are colliding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romeo. Thank you. You obviously mentioned the importance of economics, that actually animated in engagement. You know, where engagement was also had a political horizon. Although there is a big debate about whether you know, engagement was wrong or productive. I personally don't think that there is engagement is naive per se, but you can have naive engagement, and this is probably what happened with China. Although we have, you know, if you look at China in the 1980s, what was the source of engagement, you know, was actually quite successful, as much as, you know, the cases of Japan and Korea. It's certainly a story that was probably meant to give like realist theory. to produce, the reality that we are facing right now. Now the problem is how we can handle it. And so economically speaking, we have here Carmina that certainly has among all of us the deepest experience in economics. So maybe you can tell us, look at this tension from an economic angle.
Thank you very much, Enrico. And with your permission, I'm going to stand up so that I can stretch out a little bit, also because I'm not particularly tall, so that everybody can see me. I want to start by sincerely thanking all those who made it possible for all of us to be here. And therefore, first and foremost, Centro Studi Americani for hosting us in this wonderful premises. Then, of course, Diplomazia Festival for organizing this incredibly interesting and very timely event. And then each and every one of these fabulous students that are sitting all around us, and I'm sure are already preparing their pertinent and very impertinent questions. We're very much looking forward to them. Now, being the last speaker, I hope you all will agree with me that I have at least 3 different problems. Because first and foremost, it's getting a little late here. So I got to have a moral duty to keep you all awake, and I'll do my very best to do so. Secondly, I've just learned that I'm literally standing Q&A aside between Robert and his vacation, and I definitely want to make this short. But very importantly, on a more substantive standpoint, I will try my very best to get as close as possible to the pretty high bar that the distinguished speakers who preceded me have set for myself. So I think a lot has been said about US-China competition, but I hope everyone in this room agrees that there must be some room for pragmatic strategic cooperation as well. And so I'll try and offer some added value into this very insightful discussion by touching on 3 different fronts, in which I do generally believe that that scope for cooperation does exist or maybe is already happening. I'll speak about climate change and sustainable finance. I'll mention the debt crisis in developing nations, and I'll conclude on the reform of multilateral development banks, the MDBs. Now, on climate change and sustainable finance, let me start with a little bit of a personal story. Because it just so happened that back in 2021, when Italy hosted the G20 presidency, as I'm sure many of you will remember, I was honored to advise our Minister of Finance here in Rome on sustainable finance matter. The G20 happens to have a working group on that, and that happens to be co-chaired by the United States and China. And I can tell you the level of cooperation, the frankness of the dialogue, and the goodwill to pursue common ground policy solutions was always there. So what could be those options for corporations? Well, first and foremost, I think both countries have proven a commitment to fighting the climate crisis. China recently introduced its emission trading scheme, which immediately became the world's largest. The US does not have one, the EU does, but the US did pass major legislation to support the green revolution, namely through the Inflation Reduction Act. So the political will is there. There is common will to explore common ground policy solutions, and there is one which we discussed heavily when we held the G20 presidency as Italy, which, among others, many say is absolutely needed to dramatically drive carbon emissions down. That happens to be a global price on carbon, and both countries have scope to work together on such measure. And then finally, it just so happened that there is a pretty wide climate finance gap. Colleagues from the World Bank who produced a report recently estimated that up to $3 trillion will be needed between now and 2030 to accompany the green transition in developing and emerging nations alone, China aside. Both countries have a responsibility to fill that gap. The US, as one of the industrialized nations that contributed to the bulk of the historical carbon emissions, and China as today's largest emitters. That's point number 1, climate finance, sustainable finance. But then, to quote the words of Kenya's President William Ruto, and transitioning into point number 2, in Africa at least, and I would add not just in Africa, we cannot fix the climate crisis until we fix the debt crisis. And I'm sure many people around this room know that as of today, about 60% of low-income countries are either in debt distress or at the edge of a debt crisis. Why does that matter for US and China? Well, it just so happened that China is the single largest bilateral creditor of developing countries, particularly in Africa. where 23 out of the 52 nations in debt distress are located. And the US, on the other hand, as the largest shareholder of most international financial institutions, is at the forefront of multilateral credit. So there is clear scope for cooperation, and some of it is actually already happening. Those of you who follow news about international debt and the international financial architecture will have heard that, for instance, there was recently, and finally, I would add, a solution to the Zambia national debt crisis, which took a fair amount of compromise between various creditors, including US-led international financial institutions, mainly the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and China. And so therefore, that also offers an opportunity to revisit the governance of some of those international financial institutions. Because when it comes to the IMF, as I said, the US is the largest shareholder and de facto veto player. And there are other countries, including, but not only limited to China, that because of this roaring growth that they experienced over the past few decades, no longer see a correspondence between their GDP level and their voting rights allocation. So if you look at that voting rights allocation, it looks a lot more like 1944 and a lot less like 2024. And I think it's in the mutual interest of US and China of pursuing at least a partial reform of that governance that could entail, for instance, the US agreeing to a partial increase of a voting rights allocation for all emerging countries, not just China, and China, from its end, committing to play by the rules. It must also be said that the US has got a couple of problems on its end between its existing commitments in Ukraine and now in the Middle East, between a paralyzed Congress, and between a looming 2024 presidential election, where part of the electorate might not be keen to see their government committing additional funds overseas. So it is in the interest of America to bring China into debt negotiation discussions through the multilateral system, including by considering a reform of the governance of some of those institutions. And that brings me to the third and final point, which to a certain extent I've already mentioned, which is the one about the reform of multilateral development banks. I happen to do a lot of work for one of them, which is the World Bank, but that's not the only one. And there's gotta have a clear role to play for those MDBs in tackling both the climate crisis as well as the debt crisis among the various global challenges that we are facing. And so you can see that everything is closely interconnected. The World Bank is notoriously influenced to a certain extent, I would say, by US among other Western shareholders, while China has now its own MDB, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, AIIB. And it just so happened that there is quite a lot of talk these days about how to reform those MDBs. Actually, the Indian G20 presidency, which wrapped up its process a couple of weeks ago with the heads of state summit in New Delhi, presented a two-part report that calls for a major revolution in those banks. It calls for banks that can be bigger, bolder, and better. Bigger banks, therefore banks that are able to finance larger projects, up to 350 billion in extra funds between now and 2030. Bolder banks, and therefore banks that are able to catalyze private sector investments, including in developing nations, where indeed those investments are needed to face the climate crisis. You can see that everything is closely interconnected. And better banks, banks that can work better together in a cooperative manner. When it comes to the World Bank, for instance, and the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, it just so happened a lot of that cooperation is already happening on the ground. And for instance, over the last 3 years, over 20 projects were co-financed by those entities, totaling over 4 billion of co-financing, making the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank the World Bank's larger co-financing partner. So between sustainable finance, the debt crisis, and the reform of the NDBs, there are genuine opportunities for frank cooperation. And on a closing note, let me just finish to where I started from. It just so happened that while Italy in 2021 hosted the G20, it played, in my very humble view, honest broker in the sustainable finance discussions between the US and China. Italy will again hold the presidency of another multilateral forum next year, the G7. Now, until very recently, the G7 used to be considered defunct by many pundits, but in this new, increasingly complex and dangerous world in which we live, it seems to have now resurrected, up to the point that US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently labeled it the steering committee of the free world. China, on its end, is looking to expand the role of the BRICS Forum, as we have seen recently, with a major expansion in membership announced at the BRICS Heads of States Summit held in South Africa a couple of weeks ago. And who knows, maybe Italy has once again the opportunity to play honest broker between the two superpowers, now with its role as head of the G7 presidency next year. We're sitting in Rome this afternoon, so I thought I would end on a hopefully positive note that somewhat also connects to our host country. Thank you very much.
That's impressive, Carmine. Thank you very much. And also thank you for the speakers, because we are perfectly on time. And so we have at least half an hour for the Q&A. So we have actually, I see some colleagues sitting at the table from colleague from John Cabot University, from University of Naples Orientale. And also there is Professor, yes, there is also Professor Federico Argentieri, who is the director of the Guarini. Federico, can you raise your hand? Yes, here he's the director of the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs, which is the co-organizer of this panel. So we start collecting questions. Okay, we have a question here. Maybe we collect like 3 questions and then we ask this. So please clarify who you are asking the question to. You can introduce yourself.
Hello, okay, maybe I should better to start. Hello, my name is Pania. I'm Jiu-Jitsu student from Iran, and I have a couple of questions. The first question, I think, is for the professor, is that I would like to feel the relationship and the tensions between China and the US. Is it like something relationship between India and Pakistan, that they don't like each other, or like Iran and Iraq, that they look someone of each be weakened more and they attack or like change the power scale? And another thing is that mentions that China reached a high GDP and without democracy, but young people, at least to my perception that I have been in contact with them, are not happy with them, with the high pressure, with a high work pressure situation. And human resources are scarcity occurs quite often in China. Would this trend stop China somewhere, or China also have plans for the stimulate the process to keep its young civilian, better to say? And the third one is that China attracted some countries like Iran and East Asia countries. Even also, it's worth mentioning that kind of rents one of the island in Iran and have the information and allow us to use the resources of the Kish Island for the 25 years in a row, even if the regime changes. It's a kind of strong contract. And I was wondering that US feels that the alliance that already have is enough, or looking for other nations to influence and be pro-US. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we take one more question, given there are 2. Just try to focus on one question. Please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Giulia Maria Radicchi from Italy. I'm a second-year student of global governance. So my question regards the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. We know that the United States, we can say, has an ambiguous relationship with Taiwan because it doesn't recognize the state juridically, but at the same time, it does allow Taiwan to participate into international organizations. And also, according, if I'm not mistaken, according to the Taiwan Relations Act, it's called, the United States supposedly is the first provider of arms to Taiwan. So I would like to know from your point of view how the relationship between Taiwan and the United States will evolve in future years, also considering that China has recently, let's say, strengthened its power towards this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So maybe we start answering this question. I guess we have two for Professor Ross and one for Romel.
India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, oh, they border each other, don't they? So following Romeo's point, I am a realist. Neighboring countries rarely get along. Why? Because their power is right up against another country, and that power right up against another country makes the other country nervous. So I can tell the other country, I'm a friendly country, but they got a gun pointed at my head, so I'm going to worry. China now has a gun pointed at America, and we're the two most powerful countries in the world, competing in the most economically important region of the world, in a region in which both countries have major vital security interests. We're not going to get along. We're not going to be friends. We're not going to cooperate. Forgive me, but we're not going to cooperate. China's doing more for global warming than any other country by subsidizing their solar industry to a great extent, by subsidizing their wind industry by a great extent, to making solar and wind technologies available around the world at very low prices. So to enable other countries to buy them and to enable global warming to reduce faster, the United States says, we will not allow your wind technology and your solar technology into the United States. That's not cooperation. You want to cooperate on global warming, then you say, thank you, China, for providing cheap global warming technology to America. We don't do that. This is a full-blown competitive relationship across the entire spectrum. And global warming, for example, is taking a back seat to strategic competition. And nothing's going to change that. So where's it go for the next 10 years? It's going to get worse. Collision of interest, not a conflict of interest. Dialogue's not going to help. And our major objective, so the Biden administration clearly knows they're risking things because they want China to say no war, but they won't say no war. So Taiwan is the issue here. American policy is on two tracks. One track is we will never recognize Taiwan as an independent country, and we will not allow Taiwan to declare independence. Period. But we're going to expand U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation significantly. And in so doing, we're going to give Taiwan significant political support, significant economic support, significant military support. And in so doing, the word we use is hollow out the one China principle. So all that's left is we will not recognize Taiwan. Now, that's not good enough for the mainland for multiple reasons. One is when the United States builds up these relationships, it says to the Taiwan government, we have your back. You have our full support. The president said that, right? We'll go to war to defend you, right? Well, the Chinese worry that if you give the Taiwan leadership such full support, they might do something stupid, confident America will deter Taiwan from attacking him. So the mainland's worried that our policy is actually encouraging Taiwan independence. And they said that. That's basically what they said. You are cooperating with independence activists with your security policy. And that's true. And so we're aware of that, the risk we're running. But then second, and this is important, the mainland has always said they can be patient. First of all, the mainland has no intention to invade Taiwan. Let's be clear about that. The Secretary of Defense in the United States has said they cannot invade Taiwan. They don't have the power, the military capability. And then he went on to say, even if they get the military capability, they still won't want to invade Taiwan because it would be a long, dangerous war. And those of you who know Chinese history know that going back to 1895, when was the Sino-Japanese War? Right? The most vilified man in Chinese history is Li Hongzhang, because he did not defeat the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War. Imagine Xi Jinping going to war against Taiwan and not winning. That's worse than trying to invade Taiwan and winning. They're not going to invade Taiwan, but what they're worried about is they've always said we can be patient as long as the trend is moving in the right direction. It's been moving in the wrong direction for the last 8 years. Taiwan has consolidated its independent role in the world, consolidating its culture of an independent Taiwan culture, an independent political system, independent society, and consciously moving further away from unification. I worry about a crisis. If the next president of Taiwan is Lai Ching-te, he will have 4 more years of the same policy. And sometime the Chinese will say, stop this trend. People don't realize it. They want unification. They really do. They really want to bring Taiwan back. But it's moving in the wrong direction. And if there's a crisis, things can get, unpredictable things can happen between a rising power and a declining power that we should all worry about.
Thank you, Bob. Romeo, when you say they want Taiwan back where?
They want reunification, as they say, of Taiwan with the mainland.
No, just to make clear,
Yes.
Taiwan has never been part of the PRC.
Within the PRC, yes.
Yeah, no, but no, we say back. So Taiwan has never been part of the
Oh, I
People's
see.
Republic of
Yes, so
China.
Enrico's point is, the last time Taiwan was part of China, it was not the PRC. But so the mainland does use the term reunification, meaning it was once part of China. They want to bring it back into China, now under the PRC. Yeah, that's right.
The point I raise is that democracy is not an automatic consequence. The experience of Europe, mostly Western Europe and North America, was given that individualism was the intellectual mainstay of the civilized, industrialized, and modern world. History of Asia is different. So it's not a matter of to make a ranking of values. Of course, democracy is better than dictatorship or authoritarian state. The question is if democracy is automatically applicable to East Asia or to China, which never knew in its history a day of what we call freedom and democracy. So the miscalculation done at the end of last century is that that was a process pacific and wanted by the population, which we don't know. There is no verification of the political orientation of the population of China because they don't vote. But they never vote. And then another message from China, which was successful, is that you do not need necessarily democracy to defeat poverty, to create prosperity, maybe to build up consensus, of which we don't know the size. True. But probably at some time it does exist. So one of the byproducts of this success of China is that some other countries, mostly developing countries, might be tempted to imitate what China did. You know, the strong man, the helmsman. And there is a temptation which is gain popularity because it works. And on the other side, we have, at least in Europe, or maybe in Italy, a certain amount of decline in conditions of living, economic indicators, growth of GDP, zero growth. And that might lead to a consequence of no imitation game for other countries. So either we create some values, common and shared values, but it implies that we should engage China more. But probably it is too late now because we promote a country which has different values, still working. Difficult solution.
Yes, Professor Messina and Bogdan, Professor Messina first.
Well, I really appreciated this realistic approach. I think it was very honest, very. No. But let me give to the audience. We have a very young audience some figures that explain how that confirm what you were saying. In the last 30 years, from 1991 to 2020, the Chinese GDP went from 6% of the American GDP to 73%. We were born in a world that was completely different from now. When I was a student, China was a poor country. Now it's 73% of the American GDP. In the same period, Japan went from 58% of the American GDP to 24%. If you think the most important American ally in the Pacific lost half of its power. And while the European Union in 1991 was 109% of the American GDP, now is 73% for the same level with China. And before COVID, China was expected to surpass the American GDP in 2032. I don't know if this is they still have the same forecast. But all this is not strange. I mean, if you look at the last the last 2,000 years, China has always been around 30 to 35% of the world GDP. China is simply going back to its role, to its position. Is after all, the population China has justifies that level of global GDP. Now, the question is, what can be done for the United States, for the West, to adjust with this unavoidable change? I don't think China can be stopped. And China should not be stopped. Stopping China would be to maintain population at a lower GDP per capita than they would deserve. Therefore, why China should be? China should not have the right to grow. No, that's wrong as a project. Then what can we do to have a world that allows China the possibility to grow, but maintain the rest of the world without fear? Because of course people in Taiwan are very worried about reunification. And again, China has all the right to have the ambition to reunify its country, because China was one, and of course Taiwan was not part of People's Republic of China, but actually Taiwan for a long time said that China was one, and the mainland was part of the Republic of China. Now, the problem is this realistic approach, also it becomes a constraint, because you need to put values on the table if you want to have a discourse that can be appealing. I mean, if you look now, China is the main trading partner for Southeast Asia. It's the main trading partner for Africa. It's the main trading partner for Latin America. If you take out Mexico, with the rest of Latin America, China is the largest trading partner, both import and export. Now, this change is, and part of the story is the fact that a lot of countries do not see the United States as the best partner, because the United States is looking at its own interest, not at the interest of also these other countries. The project globalization that now has ended. Yes, protect. I mean, the United States with Obama had a strong discourse. The pivot to Asia, not redefining the rules for trade in Asia with a Trans-Pacific Partnership. But when this was abandoned, then the United States went back to protectionism. Then, of course, the United States was not appealing. And I don't see with the Biden administration a significant shift. We are still there. Therefore, can the United States become again a leader at the international level without having a discourse that is appealing for other countries? And this is what I don't see at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, maybe Bogdan, you want to jump in, ask a question, and then you can answer, Carmen, also if you want to. Yeah.
I'll talk quickly. I'm less persuaded the Chinese model is significant. Countries don't change their economic systems because they like China. They don't change their political systems. They're entrenched in their country. But what it means is they look to China as the future. So they want to cooperate with the future. And they see China as a partner. So if if the 20th century was the American century, many countries see the 21st century as China's century. Why? You want a bridge built, you go to China. You want an airport built, you go to China. You want to expand your trade, you go to China. America's protectionist. We have no aid money. We say to our trade agreements, we're not going to give you more access, but we'll give better rules. They want more access. Our aid budget is not even 1/10 of what China's is on an annual basis. So when they say, who should we cooperate with? They say China. Because they see it as a successful model, and because they see it as in their interest from trade and access to the economy and aid. But you're right. I don't think there's any stopping China. If China grows at 4% a year, we say, look how slow they're growing. Well, America grows at 2%. That's twice as fast as America, isn't it? That's right. So you can't take comfort from China's problems and say they're no longer a problem. They're going to grow faster than any advanced industrial country, and that's going to be a problem. So how do we adjust? My own preference for the United States? Why can't we accept a bipolar world? Huh? We had a bipolar world during the Cold War. We've always said that our interests lie in Europe and East Asia having more than one great power. So now we have to be the only great power? That's what adjustment requires. When did it happen in US-Soviet relations? First, it happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh my God, we have to be careful and cooperate. That may be what's necessary for America to come to terms and accept China as an equal. The other one was Richard Nixon and détente with the Soviet Union. When he realized he couldn't continue an arms race, the economy wasn't strong enough, and that we had to have détente with the Soviet Union and recognize the Soviet Union's interest in Europe. I think that's what it's going to take for us to come to terms with rising China, is for America to conclude that the competition is not in our interest, is not possible and dangerous, or dangerous. Or China fails. It's one or the other. But someone has to decide that this competition is no longer sustainable, and that could take 10 years.
Please, Karen. Yeah. Please.
I just wanted to react real quick at the intervention of the gentleman here, which I think is very, very interesting, because if we were not living in such a dangerous world, which unfortunately we are, at least as an economist or as a global governance student, I think this would be an incredibly interesting thing to look at what's going to happen with China in terms of their next step from an economic growth perspective. Because originally, as we all know, the model was basically based on trading low-tech manufacturing goods, exploiting a depreciated currency. Then it came the real estate, maybe the next thing of the solar panel, but how many of these switches can you go until you hit a ceiling? And now we are seeing that between the real estate bubble that might be about to burst and youth employment numbers, of which we never get the real figures for very obvious reasons, and at incredibly high private savings levels, which for those of you who study economics know is never a good thing for an economy, things are not looking great. So it's going to be interesting to see when and if a ceiling is hit. I don't think that's going to come anytime soon, but it is an interesting thing to watch. But then more broadly speaking, in terms of what we can offer and what China has to offer. And now I put back on my hat as a World Bank advisor. When we go into developing nations, be it in Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, anywhere in the world, and we start discussing concession loans or even grants for infrastructural development and other things, sometimes people are bored because our processing times are too long. Or sometimes people don't like our apparently stringent environmental and social safeguard conditions, and they like the Chinese resources because they can disperse faster, they come with less or no strings attached, and they can also be used faster. But then at the same time, this year, we happen to be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a whole different topic. I don't want to derail the conversation. But it just so happened that over the past 3 years or so, for instance, we had 14 episodes of default in 9 countries, 8 of which were BRI partners. And this goes back to the issue that I was saying in terms of international debt crisis and how can we deal with it. So I don't think we're yet at the stage that countries around the world have realized that Chinese resources are actually entirely free of strings attached. They're different strings, but still there are strings. But until we hit those ceilings, a domestic ceiling with the economic growth process of China and an external ceiling in terms of countries around the world realizing that taking loans or financial support or other forms of cooperation from China is not necessarily always a great deal, we continue to have a problem.
Thank you very much, Carmen. So if my colleagues allow me, Federico, Bogdan, and Michael, we have 3 students, they want to ask a question, even though they have the, priority. So maybe I would like them to ask question first, and then we move to the scholar. We very, very fast, guys. Just one quick question because we don't have much time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I'm Samuele, I'm a global governance student. So I would like to ask, we know that China has just 1 military basis outside its territory, in Djibouti, I think, while the USA have hundreds and hundreds in many different countries. So my question is it possible for China to compete with the US from a military point of view without any strong real military alliance? And what's the prospect of military alliances of China?
Great. Second question. Yes. Mike, you want to stand up and use the mic there on the table? So the question is, which are the sectors that are at the forefront of the competition between US and China, right? Yes? Which are the sectors that are at the forefront of the competition between US and China? And then, Lucius in Fundo, we have the last question.
I'd like to question how much we are responsible for our own suffering in the situation of China. We provided them with the economic basis. We have them for their cheap labor to provide for our global needs. How much are we responsible within the current situation within our discourse of China and vilify this role rather than looking at it as a complex state with regional goals and international?
Okay, maybe Romeo, maybe you can answer this last question, and then we start with Romeo.
Okay.
You address this last question, and then
A quick answer for your question. Yes, we are. Either we are responsible, guilty, miscalculators. It's difficult to say. Let's say that there was a strange, a bizarre marriage between the necessity of multinationals to reshore, offshore, and the necessity of China of a shortcut to industrialization. It was a win-win situation. The oddity of the case was the best friend of multinationals was a communist country. That is bizarre.
thank you, Romeo. Bob, you want to jump?
Question of alliances and Chinese competition. I think we misunderstand the role of alliances. America gave an alliance to the European countries after World War II because the European alliances didn't trust that we would be there. So we had to give an alliance to reassure them, we will defend you. You can count on us. We gave an alliance to Japan and to the Philippines and Pakistan because they were far away. We had just gone home after World War II. We say, we'll give you alliance, we will defend you. And so doing, we said, you don't have to succumb to Soviet power. You don't have to come to Chinese power. Chinese don't need alliances. Vietnam doesn't dare challenge China because it's there. Thailand doesn't challenge China because it's right there. Myanmar doesn't challenge China. It's right there. So we talked about how the ASEAN countries can deal with China. Singapore is getting close, getting to the middle between the US and China every day, just by Chinese power being there. Same with Malaysia, same with Indonesia. Because they're there, they don't need that alliances to provide commitments to other countries, persuade them that China cares. and that China will use its power because they all know it will. So I think China doesn't need alliances to succeed in East Asia. It's doing just fine without them. The forefront of the issue is military the forefront of the issue, as Romeo was saying, was the economic rise of China, the technological rise of China, and its contribution to Chinese military power. And that's why America's focused on trade with China. That's why it's focused on technology with China. It's trying to stop China from militarily challenging the United States, because it's that military challenge that's persuading Singapore to be nicer to China, Malaysia to be nicer to China. There was a Philippine legislator who said, we know who the real military power is in East Asia. America sails the ships in and they go home. China's here all the time. That's the reality from the Chinese Navy. Just a quick thing on responsibility. I don't know what else we could have done, right? I mean, if you think of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, America couldn't do it alone. Europe wasn't going to help us. Japan wasn't going to help us. So there was no China threat. So of course, America didn't have a choice. Second, I don't think we were naive. No one thought, I shouldn't say that. Academics didn't think we were turning China into a democracy. There were politicians who might have sold it to the American people that way. So the American people were naive because they believed it. But I don't think anyone believed China was turning into a democracy. Third, I think we were fairly successful in persuading China to become a stakeholder. People look at the ADB, I'm sorry, not the ADB, the Asian Investment Bank, say its rules are pretty similar to the World Bank. China's renminbi is pretty much at what people say it's what its values should be. It's negotiating with third world countries in debt restructuring. I somewhat disagree. There's no cooperation, because we say to the Chinese, let's work together within the IMF, and the Chinese say, wait a minute, we have an 8% share of IMS and you want us to support the IMS? Not going to happen. So what they're doing is they're negotiating with individual countries rather than supporting the IMF. But they're reaching agreements with Sri Lanka, right, and other countries that look fairly reasonable. People have looked at the One Belt, One Road agreement, say they're a little stricter than Western agreements, but not by much. China's been fairly Now, I don't know what would have happened if we had given China 30% in the IMF. Would they have been any different? I don't know. But all I can say is, given what we did, of course they're building the AIB. Of course they're building the BRICS. But then you have to look within that and think, are they behaving differently than the rules would suggest? And I don't think so.
Thank you so much, Bob. I'm afraid we have 3 minutes. So last question. And Federico, forgive me if you can, because Bogdan was, okay, Federico, okay, so then, okay.
Both of them,
Go ahead,
right?
yeah.
Okay, sorry, it might sound off topic, but maybe it's not. You decide. It's for any of the 3 speakers. Is China going to change its position vis-a-vis the current Middle Eastern crisis because of India's endorsement of Israeli position, which is the news of earlier today? Number 1. Number 2, this is a little provocative, but not deprived of some background. Is China likely to take advantage if there is an overall fall apart of Russia, which is not to be ruled out, in my opinion? Please.
You want the other?
And how is the US going to
You want
react?
the student to ask a question too?
No, it's okay. Because no, we have to close. We have to close. So
I'm done.
Sure.
I'm done.
Okay. China began competing in the Middle East in about June this year. And clearly what happened is we told them, everyone told them, we told ourselves, Joe Biden will be different. He's rational, he's pragmatic. Guess what? He wasn't different, he was worse. And they gave Joe Biden 2 years and they said, time to push back. So now they brokered a Saudi-Iran deal. They're cooperating with Syria. They are now going to compete with the United States in the Middle East in reaction to and response to America's competition with China around the world. Regarding where they stand, what does China say? They say, we want a ceasefire, we want humanitarian considerations, and we want ceasefire humanitarian considerations, and there was something else in there. That sounds pretty reasonable to me. If you think which country is better positioned to negotiate a Middle East ceasefire, and it's the same in the Ukraine. China's better positioned to negotiate peace in the Ukraine than the United States because we have a Cold War conflict with China and we're helping the Ukraine kill Russians. Russians are going to work with us. Chinese are the best great power position, along with France, to have a more middle position. And the same thing in the Middle East. Yeah, I mean, the United States doesn't have any influence with the Gaza, with Hamas, with the West Bank, because we were helping the Israelis repress them for the last 20, 30 years, right? This is just our reality. So the Chinese position sounds like the American policy of 20 years ago. Two-state solution. Humanitarian concerns and the ceasefire. That sounds pretty reasonable. Russia. Not sure what take advantage means. But when the Chinese look north in the Far East, they see what America looks north and sees Canada. Geopolitically, strategically, politically, Canadians say, you know what it's like to live next to the most powerful country in the world? We think they're friends, they like us. Well, it's pretty, if you're Canadians, it's not a pleasant experience to live next to the most powerful country in the world. There are no Russians in the Far East. There are no railroads in the Far East. There are no ports in the Far East. There are no people. There's no electricity. There's nothing there. This is one big vacuum. So that the Russians are not going to pick a fight with China because they can't defend their border. Now, if Russia falls apart, what would China want that's any better than that? Actually move into the Russian Far East? What do they want to do that for? I'm not sure what take advantage means. They might give aid and this and that. But Russia hasn't been much valued to China as an ally for the last 15, 20 years. It's been a basket case. No economy, no military. Look what's happening in the Ukraine. So if it were to fall apart, it would be worse than the present, but I'm not sure how Chinese policy would change.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you all for being with us. It was a great panel indeed. And thank you to the Center for American Studies and for hosting us in cooperation with Guarini Institute for Public Affairs. Thank you so much.